So is it a vote winner to extend the Thatcherite dream of a property-owning democracy to housing association tenants? That's the announcement today from Mr Cameron. Will it sort out the lack of social housing? We're going to talk now to two politicians who both grew up on council estates but who have very different views on the right to buy because they're in different parties. David Davis is the former Shadow Home Secretary, Conservative candidate from Halton, Price and Howden. And Alan Johnson is former Home Secretary and Labour candidate for Hull West and Hessel. And if I'll start with you, Alan, tell us about your feelings about this policy, given that I know you had a chance to buy your own council house and didn't.
I did. And hello, Jeremy, by the way. Yeah, I did. But I mean, I lost the argument in the early 80s, both personally and politically. I tell the story in my book of all the people who lived in my part of that Bretwell estate in Slough. We were all young families with kids. And I would argue with good friends and neighbours, and I lost the argument completely. I had very personal reasons why I didn't want to buy my council house, i.e. it was the only opportunity I had to leave the slums and have my own front door. But I lost that argument personally. I lost it politically. I think this is a different kettle of fish, actually. I mean, actually, it was David. I know David Davis, my very good friend from up here, is on next. It was his idea back in 2003. I think it's the wrong idea, and I think Ruth Davison's absolutely right. There's a big difference between a policy back in the 80s that actually didn't create a home-owning democracy. We've now got the lowest level of home ownership since 1985, and now going to the only sector where you do have some security and some manageable rents, the housing associations, and saying that you're going to sell them off as well. How does that solve the problem of an absence of housing at a reasonable price? It doesn't solve it at all, well, apart from the magic money tree figures that they seem to be getting this money from.
Okay, well, David Davis, just down the road from where you are, maybe as somebody who also grew up in a council estate, maybe you can answer, Alan.
Yeah, we're parliamentary neighbours as well, so it's quite funny, this. But look, the thing comes down to what Ruth Davison actually said. She talked about people being in very secure accommodation with subsidised rents. What happens is when somebody gets a house like that is they stay there forever, for their entire life, and maybe longer in their family's case. And therefore, you haven't got that house available for other people, the million-plus people on the waiting list to get council or social housing of one sort or another. And what this will do is two or three things at once. It gives that family the chance to own their own home and paint their own door, whatever colour they want, run it the way they want. And at the same time, it releases the capital to spend on more social housing. Now, the mistake in the Thatcherite policy was they never were allowed to spend the money. When the council sold the house, they couldn't spend the money on building more council houses. We changed this policy back in the early 2002-3, as Alan says, to say, no, let's actually make a use of this to do two things. We create more home ownership, which is very popular with lots and lots of Labour voters. My stepfather and mother bought their council house on the one hand, but also use the money to build new social housing, because the housing associations are doing a good job of maintaining existing housing. They're not providing enough new housing, and this will provide the money to do that, or at least three-quarters of the money to do that.
Okay, Alan, good point there from David, that actually these houses that are being rented by housing association tenants are not really available because there's somebody in them.
Yeah, lots of them are elderly people. Lots of them in my constituency, and maybe David's, are from the former fishing community. This is the way they get housed. Now, the issue, we've got to learn by our mistakes. What David said would happen in the 80s didn't happen. Yes, one reason was because the legislation specifically stopped councils from building new houses. It precluded it. Yeah. But the other thing was, what used to happen, and David knows this, is when a couple got married and had no children, they'd go and live in a flat, a council flat. As people were in council houses and had families, they would save the money to get a mortgage and then move into the private sector. The couple in the flat, when they had kids, would then move into their house. That stopped happening. A lot of the problems we have in housing actually began with that sell-off policy in the 80s. And I just can't accept David's view that there is so much expensive housing under local authority ownership at the moment to be sold off to actually match this figure, which I mean, the calculation is 4.5 billion. The National Housing Federation say it's 5.8 billion. That is just pie in the sky. It's not going to happen.
So you've got to raise some money from this, David Davis, but we're wondering whether 4.5 billion is realistic.
Well, I'm sure that is. I mean, the Housing Federation and others have bandied around 5.8, 20 billion. They're picking numbers out of the air. Look, there are three points to make here. Number one, Alan's rather sort of eulogistic view of the way council housing worked, frankly, was never true even in those days. It's certainly not true now. People get a nice house, their family come, their family grow up, they go, they stay in a nice big council house which they don't want to move out of because it's a bit difficult to do and awkward and they like their neighbours and so on. So it doesn't turn over in the way Alan says. The second point about this is this will release everything except the discount, basically, from the sort of housing market. So let's say you've got a £200,000 house. You buy that, you get your discount of no more than 70,000 or 78,000 for most of the country outside London, and the rest of that money is there to buy another house. The government simply has to provide the subsidy, the discount, if you like. And it's going to get that by selling, we think about 15,000. They've assessed the numbers, about 15,000 houses a year that come vacant, which are very expensive council houses, in order to generate this money and the so-called Brownfield Development Fund. The numbers work on this. They've been very, very carefully worked up. But we come back to the fundamental. This is a way of releasing capital to provide new social housing for people on the waiting list. They aren't getting that social housing now. Under the Labour government, they aren't getting it. Under us, they're getting it slightly better, but still not enough. That's the way to do it.
Thank you very much. No, I sense a double act forming here. We'll get you both back in to commentate on other things. Thank you.
All right.
Cheers. David Davis, former Shadow Home Secretary, Conservative candidate at the moment. Alan Johnson, of course, Labour candidate, former Home Secretary. So top draw guests for you today. And as they said, in neighbouring constituencies, so they're campaigning just down the road from each other in the Hull area.